Good evening, everyone. This is our third in a series of broadcasts on LaRouche's Four Laws, and tonight's guest will be Jason Ross. Those of you that are listening live over the internet, you'll be able to send your questions in to LaRouche's Four Laws at gmail.com. That's LaRouche's, the number 4, laws at gmail.com. We also have listeners on a call-in line that will be able to ask questions to Jason during the question and answer period also. So, as I said, this is our third in a series of classes, and tonight's guest, Jason, is ready, so we'll take it away. Go ahead, Jason.
Okay, thanks, Gene. So this is a follow-up class. This is the third in a series of 4 class on LaRouche's 4 Laws. If you haven't read this document several times already, then feel free to read it again. It's available at LaRouchePAC.com/4 FOUR laws. I was going to actually go ahead and read the third of these 4, since that's the topic for today's discussion, and then jump into the meat of things. So, in laying out why he introduced these 4 laws, Mr. LaRouche has said that the collapse of the transatlantic financial system and the move towards bail-in makes it undeniable, makes it impossible to avoid the fact that this heads in the direction of a global war. And that, he says, the only location for the immediate necessary action which could prevent such an immediate genocide throughout the transatlantic sector of the planet requires the U.S. government's now immediate decision to institute 4 specific cardinal measures, measures which must be fully consistent with the specific intent of the original U.S. federal Constitution, as had been specified by U.S. Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton. The first is Glass-Steagall. The second is national banking. Now, I think Paul Gallagher did a wonderful job. If you haven't seen the first 2 of these presentations, definitely watch them. He did a great discussion on those 2 topics. I'm going to go ahead and read the third of these 4. LaRouche writes, the purpose of the use of a federal credit system is to generate high productivity trends in improvements of employment, with the accompanying intention to increase the physical economic productivity and the standard of living of the persons and households of the United States. The creation of credit for the now urgently needed increase of the relative quality and quantity of productive employment must be assured this time, once more, as was done successfully under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, or by like standards of federal practice used to create a general economic recovery of the nation, per capita, and for rate of net effects in productivity, and by reliance on the essential human principle, which distinguishes the human personality from the systemic characteristics of the lower forms of life. The net rate of increase of the energy flux density of effective practice. This means intrinsically a thoroughly scientific rather than a merely mathematical one, and by the related increase of the effective energy flux density per capita and for the human population, when considered as each and all as a whole. The ceaseless increase of the physical productivity of employment, accompanied by its benefits for the general welfare, are a principle of federal law which must be a paramount standard of achievement of the nation and of the individual. So that's what we're going to focus on today. The fourth of the 4 laws is on a fusion driver crash program, and although that will probably be touched on tonight, we're going to have a full presentation on what it would mean to have a fusion driver in the class next week. So, what can we say about this? We've got the standard of energy flux density as a way of measuring human actual growth. And also, Mr. LaRouche said that we need to have a scientific rather than a merely mathematical standard for this. So what does that mean? So let's get into that. To put this in context, I wanted to use a few examples, put this in the context of Mr. LaRouche's wonderful economics book called So, You Wish to Learn All About Economics. That book is 30 years old this year. It was produced in 1984, so 30 years ago. And if what Mr. LaRouche had laid out in that book had been studied and been comprehended by even, a reasonably small number, well, a greater number than actually does, but not that many people would have to understand these concepts to make it the hegemonic view in the country. The fact that what Mr. LaRouche presents in that book, which when you work through it seems actually very simple and straightforward and makes a whole lot of sense, the fact that that has not taken over, we can talk about what that means, why that has been. So to start with, the first value that LaRouche gives in that book is he talks about the difference between physical value and monetary value. That most of economics is really just about money, and it's not about economics at all. So this happens all the time when we have got political figures who lie and make political statements. They're really public representation kind of people. They're PR people. They're advertisers. They're making statements not because they believe them, not because they think that they're true, but because they're trying to achieve some other end, and they use these statements as their way to get there, playing politics. That's what economists do. For the most part, any economic theory that you get in school, if you had the misfortune of learning anything about it there, is generally PR for the empire. Theories whose origin come not from people trying to understand economy to better it, but by trying to promote a specific view of man, which then guided the development of that economics. If you compare, for example, two classes of economists, we think of people like Gottfried Leibniz, who LaRouche says is the founder of physical economics. Leibniz. Ben Franklin, who was as well known as a scientist as a political figure on his trips to Europe in many circles. Alexander Hamilton, he had become a general in the army, was the aide-de-camp of Washington, the first Treasury Secretary. Leibniz, who developed many branches of science, developed the calculus, worked on reunifying the Protestant and Catholic churches in Europe, sought for ways to develop trade and industry among nations. These thinkers, to take them as examples, Leibniz, Franklin, Hamilton, they had a view of studying economics not in an abstract way, but because they wanted to do something with it, because they wanted to improve it, to improve mankind as a whole. And the study of economics for them was, frankly, the greatest of the sciences. That's how Mr. LaRouche views it. That there is no other science that ties together and gives validity to all the other sciences in the same way that economics does. More on that in a moment. So if we compare these kinds of economists with, run-of-the-mill brand X academic economists, such as Adam Smith, who was British, in case people forgot. The Wealth of Nations was, it was an attack on the United States. So people like Smith, like Malthus, like Bentham, people who wrote articles about why pederasty should be allowed, why usury was good, why suicide was to be encouraged among those who had hard lots in life. These thinkers, these people, didn't want to develop the economy. They wanted to maintain empire, and they came up with economic theories that explicitly attack the very concept that's central to what Mr. LaRouche lays out in these 4 laws. They attacked explicitly the idea that it's possible to know how to develop an economy. They said that Adam Smith said this very famously, that God constructed the universe in such a way that if every person sought out his own pleasures and avoiding pains that might come his way, such as the pains that might come from attacking an empire, that if you avoid those kinds of discomforts and seek out your own pleasures, God is so wonderful that that will improve the world. That'll improve humanity. That's not true. That's what these guys had to say. And it was a view of mankind, a view of human beings. So throwing all of that hogwash away and getting into the study for serious people like ourselves who want to know and who need to know, who are responsible for knowing how does a national economy run so that we're able to provide the needed leadership to the ignorant masses and elites. There are some very important concepts. So the first of these that Mr. LaRouche brings up in this a specific one here and then also in his book is energy flux density. And this is a very powerful concept and at the same time a reasonably simple one. The energy Maybe that's a familiar concept. What you've got in your mind about it is probably adequate for this. Energy density is how much energy do you have, how concentrated is it, for example, and then flux means the flow. So what Mr. LaRouche calls a funny contradiction, well, he doesn't call it a funny contradiction, but he calls it an unusual contradiction, is that through the uniquely human ability to develop new scientific principles and apply them in the economy as a whole, we're able to accomplish more work with less effort. How is that? It's a common thing to human development. The development of agriculture, the development of metallurgy, the discoveries in chemistry, the development of electromagnetism, Louis Pasteur and the breakthroughs in the life sciences, in sanitation, in medicine, etc. These things have, you can try to calculate a monetary value for them, but Mr. LaRouche says let's look at it from a different standpoint. One standpoint, energy flux density. We have moved from fire in the standpoint of wood fire, which is very helpful, provides many benefits. You can cook your food, kill things in it. You can be safe. You can boil water, which means you can eat other things. You can bend wood with that. You can harden different kinds of rocks with a simple wood fire. With the creation of charcoal from wood, which is basically made by burning wood very slowly in an oxygen-poor environment, you create charcoal, which, as people with grills know, gets much hotter than wood. And with charcoal, we had the ability to have enough power and enough carbon to be able to transform materials around us, to create new materials that had never before existed on Earth. So cooked meat, you might say, well, there's, lightning strikes a bird, and then you've got KFC. That wasn't, you didn't need people for that. But the creation of bronze doesn't exist anywhere on the Earth except when people make it. It's a combination of metals that maybe a few tiny grains across the entire Earth by chance, but it's something that we uniquely create. As we moved up towards higher forms of fire, of power, of energy flux density, with the use of coal, that enabled us finally to get away from solar power and muscle power. By solar power, I mean wind and rain, which is evaporated by the sun and then falls, water mills, windmills, and the power of muscles, whether human or animal. Those were the only sources of power that we had to do work for us until the development of the steam-powered engine and the ability to use coal not only for heating your home in a convenient way without having to destroy forests, the ability to use coal to make coke for metallurgy. These were very important things. However, I think even more important, clearly in history, was the development of the use of a powered engine, a heat-powered engine. This was an incredible, unprecedented, and since then unmatched discovery in terms of the application of a new technology that totally revolutionized human practice. We will see the next discovery on that order, I believe, with the development of a controlled fusion economy. More on that next week. But these different types of fire express this energy flux density that Mr. LaRouche says is essential for measuring real economic progress. That it's not only about how much energy do you have, how much power do you have. The other question is, what can you do with it? You can do a lot with the sledgehammer, but you are not going to open up a bottle of soda in a way that you're going to like. Not the way a can opener would. So that is a crucial value. Another one that I want to discuss is what Mr. LaRouche calls potential relative population density. So we just discussed energy flux density. Now we're going to discuss potential relative population density as a scientific way, a physical economic real value for our species. So many economists try to add up all of the productivity in the economy to have an idea about what it is as a whole, which isn't completely unreasonable. Look at all of the parts, and then you figure out things that you can say about the entirety. But LaRouche, he really cuts to the chase on this one. He zooms right through it. And he says, rather than trying to add up these things, there's a couple things that are missing from this approach. First off, adding up parts does not give you all the characteristics of a whole. And the second, it shows you what is and not what could be. So to address both of those, this potential relative population density concept really does the trick. First off, population density. How dense are people? And the standpoint of how many live in a certain area. So as we know, some countries are much more population dense than others. The United States is relatively empty. It may not seem like that if you live in New York City, but if you fly out to the West Coast and you look down, there's plenty of complete emptiness in the United States. A country like Luxembourg or Belgium or some others have much higher population densities. So then the question is relative population density, meaning different parts of the world are easier to live in. It's rather difficult to live in Antarctica. The most important part is potential. If you asked what is the potential population density, how many people could we support in a certain area? And Dennis discussed this in the webcast last night, I think in a very exciting way, referring to Menshikoff's unit of the law, the LaRouche. When you ask how many people can be supported per area of land, that's not a fixed value, and it's one that shows our own species' reflexive ability to transform itself. That what the human species is not something that has been defined eternally in a way that can be written down and be right forever. In some general ways it can, but in terms of what our species actually does, the way it behaves, we're unique. We're unlike any animal in that we determine what those characteristics are. We determine what those binding conditions are by our discoveries and by social developments and social structure and organization and social breakthroughs, as in culture, that allow us to apply discoveries and to foster the creation of more discoveries. What kind of culture produces creative people? You might say, well, geniuses, or they happen every so often. You can't really predict them. You can't create one, no matter what you do to your children. There's something true about that. But on the other hand, you know that you can create a culture that is going to create much more productive thinkers, much better, more human people with a moral sense of what the human species is and an intent to develop it. We do not create that when we tell our children that they are a virus on the planet and the best thing for people to do is not exist by having zero environmental impact and possibly just going ahead and committing suicide and getting it over with. So these values are very important, energy flux density and potential relative population density, because they address not what individual people are doing in the economy. It doesn't really address, although in some ways it does, it doesn't directly address what the farmer is doing, what the dairy farmer is doing, what the construction worker is doing, what the crane operator is doing, what the power plant operator is doing, how the teacher teaches. In many of those fields, the energy flux density of the technologies applied will be very demonstrative. They will tell you something. On the other hand, the potential population density of society as a whole is something that can't be measured by looking at those pieces in that way. As Leona put it on the weekly report this Wednesday, you change the whole economy. No part of the economy is the same, even people who do the same jobs. So let me try to keep this brief so we can have some discussion period here. Let me bring this up. This is a quote from Lynn, which I think is particularly beautiful. He says that this is about, he says the economy of labor in the productive process. This must be comprehended as the greatest of all scientific experiments. Right? The economy of labor in the productive process is the greatest of all scientific experiments. He says it is the experiment which proves empirically, as nothing else can, those principles of scientific discovery upon which the authority of all scientific knowledge entirely depends. That at a crucial heart of the matter, the basis for the validity of science is the power that it gives us to transform how we live. This is sometimes called a crucial experiment, the creation of a new technology by the application of a previously unapplied scientific principle. So the way that these holes, the way that these changes of entireties occur, clearly isn't through a simple change in operation of individual workers alone. It's through the creation of discovery. That means that it is impossible to fully be a competent economist without understanding both the role of scientific discovery in economy, but frankly, without understanding the basics of scientific discovery. And this is why when Mr. LaRouche created the basement process, 8 years ago now, with the assignment to work on Johannes Kepler's new astronomy, to animate and create the ability to educate on how it was that Kepler made this first discovery that set into action modern science. He said this is crucial, both from a direct application to understanding economic processes in a way like Kepler understood the orbits of the planets, but also in a broader sense that by getting inside the mind of Kepler or others, by getting inside one of these minds, by getting inside that process of discovery, that is what enables people to understand the kernel of economic growth and of economic value. So when we think about applying this, when we think about how we're going to increase the economic value of the nation as a whole, when we think about how are we going to move forward on these projects, and part of this will come up next week about the fusion economy in particular, but in terms of a recovery overall for the need for high-speed transport, if you look at what the BRICS countries are doing, you look at what China in particular is doing with the thousands of miles of high-speed rail, maglev rail, new plans in that direction, plans to help develop transportation infrastructure in Africa, plans for many more power plants, this kind of direction, which increases the potential of the people in the society to not only live better, which of course is crucial, we have to eliminate poverty, but beyond that, to enable an increasing portion of human beings to be able to participate in the shaping of the human species. The empire faction, Zeus over time, in order to prevent this, has not only destroyed living standards and enslaved people in that way. The other side of it is to create cultural and scientific ideas that neuter the ability to think creatively, to make developments in culture, to make developments in science. So I think I'd like to say a few things about that, and then we should discuss these things. So let's get at science in a second. One more example about changing things as a whole. A pedagogy that Mr. LaRouche has used is to look at a machine tool, look at some part of the productive process, where only one aspect of it has been changed, and the rest has remained the same. So let's say you have a milling machine, for example. For those who don't know, a milling machine is basically, well, if you got a drill, you got a drill bit on it, and if you've got a, one of these bench presses, it's not the right word. The thing you put on your workbench, it's got a drill press. A mill is basically an automated, well, today's ones are automated drill presses that move around the drill bit and cut out a piece of wood or metal into whatever shape you'd like. So Mr. LaRouche says, let's imagine that we've taken this device, which includes a variety of components, positioning, it's got to have sensors to make sure it's in the right spot, it's got to be able to move the drilling implement around, it's got to take care of the scraps, etc., and it's got the drill. What if we replace that drill with a laser? Now, a couple of things will happen. One, the laser represents a much higher energy flux density. The density of power in that tiny laser beam is far beyond that of a rotating drill bit. The potential for this machine is just increased. The drill bit will change its size as it heats and cools a little bit. It can cut the metal only so precisely. The laser, much more so. So what you've just done is you've made that overall machine tool more effective, more productive. Maybe it's faster. It's certainly going to be more precise and be able to create better quality products, which means it could now be used to produce parts that before it simply couldn't have. So here's what LaRouche asks. How has the value of the positioning motor changed? How has the value of the power cord that you plug it into the wall with, how has that changed? The bolts that hold the thing together, any of these components, they haven't changed. We only added the laser instead of the drilling head. But the value of every one of those components of that machine has just changed. None of them have the same value that they did before. Even the power cord, because it's now supplying power to a machine that's able to create better products. So think about that as people in an economy. It takes many people. Many people were required for the Apollo program to go to the moon. The Apollo program, which had a estimated at least 10-to-1 payback in terms of investment to the benefits that came from the new technologies. A number which, if you think about it, can't be right. One reason, we already paid for Apollo and we're done paying for it. The new technologies still work. They still benefit us every single year, all the way into the future. So that's a difference. That the number of people required wasn't only the contractors and the engineers and the astronauts and all of that. These people had to eat breakfast. Did the farmer who produced the milk for the worker who worked on making the bolts that were then used to put together the rockets, did that farmer necessarily, did their activity change? Maybe not. Did the value of their work change? Yes, it did. So when we think about how many people are trying to get by, having jobs that are increasingly vicious, this came up as a question in Paul's first class, where people asked, well, we're tied to Wall Street. Our pensions, our 401ks are in Wall Street. So how do we attack it? The people are becoming increasingly, the jobs available are increasingly actually bad on the face of them. But also, it's in a context of a society that's going nowhere. Well, going worse than nowhere. So if you're a farmer in the U.S., first off, you're barely getting by, or if you're not, going underwater every year. Compare that to a farmer in China who maybe hasn't seen many of the results yet of these development projects, but who exists in a country that's moving in that direction. Think about the value of their life, what they can honestly reflect on as being the value of what they do every day with themselves. And you think about the wonderful opportunity that we have to transform the value of everybody on the planet. That by effecting this necessary change in the United States, we can not only prevent the otherwise, really it's just moving, it's the push for war, which would be thermonuclear war, but also the opportunity to finally again be a productive and very helpful factor on the world stage. America has much to offer the world, not only our history in terms of credit, national banking, a culture of science drivers, but also at this point very specific expertise in the most important scientific fields that we need to move forward on, space science and fusion, for example. So the other aspect of that is that not only does everybody have a value, that not only does everything in the economy have a value based on its context, so do people. That can be changed. That's what political organizing does. What Schiller said, the greatest of all works of art is the creation of true political freedom. And that's the truth. The other aspect of it is that there is no person who has an existence which is simply good or bad or whatever if you look at it in terms of doing a job. Am I a good person? Do I have a list of good and bad things that I'm doing? I follow the 10 Commandments, I'm nice to my kids, I do this, I do that. You say, well, where's the world going? What's your role in that? Are you letting the United States act under the thumb of the British Empire. Well, at least I'm a good person. I may not get involved with that, but I'm still a good person. You aren't. It is impossible to just say, I'm going to take myself out of context, and I'm not going to look at that entire situation and my ability to act on that as a citizen of the U.S. That is not a context that actually exists. So let me finish up with 2 more points, and I hope you've got some questions ready there. I wanted to finish up with, I think I hit on the responsibility. Mr. LaRouche over the past week has been very emphatic that people in this organization, and by organizing outside it, that overall we're really behind the curve in terms of our the really needed understanding of economics, that we're not a protest movement, we're not trying to have the right things to say to sound correct if somebody's questioning us, that we have got to take ourselves seriously enough to think, and it's a scary thought, that we are responsible to understand. Think about that. Sometimes we've got responsibilities that are tasks. Do this, don't do that. Okay, the tasks are already defined. What about when you're responsible for doing something you've never done before? What if you're responsible for performing a task that is undefined? What do you do when your responsibility requires a discovery, requires doing something new? And that's the position that we find ourselves in. This responsibility to develop an understanding of economics, to do the work, to really own these concepts and be able to represent them and then lead with them. That's a very big job. Let me finish off with this. In this 4 laws document, let me read this sentence again. In discussing energy flux density, LaRouche wrote, "This means intrinsically a thoroughly scientific rather than a mathematical one." Very briefly on what LaRouche means by science versus mathematics. It's you might almost say poetry versus grammar or something like that. Concepts versus linguistics. That in a certain way, much of mathematics is very past-oriented. It's like linguistics or grammar or something like this. You study how a language works. What's most interesting is how one evolves and what new contradictions or thoughts that need expression that drive the development of a language. So to give one example of that, I'll use the commonly used one of Cusa and the circle. Cusa points out, this will be a very brief idea of this coincidence of opposites that Cusa has, where he says that when we try to understand things from too low a level, the answers we get, so to speak, will be contradictory. That when we get such contradictory understandings of something, it means that we are approaching it from too low a level. Here's one example. If you asked how many angles are in a circle, I think there are 2 reasonable answers you might receive. One person might say, Mary says, well, there's no straight lines in a circle. Angles occur between straight lines, and there aren't any. The circle has no angles. On the other hand, Bob might say, well, if we have a square, that's better than a triangle as far as looking like a circle. A stop sign, which has 8 sides, that looks more like a circle. Well, if we added more and more angles, it would get closer and closer to the circle. So Bob would say there's an infinite number of angles in a circle. Now, since both of these answers have a certain amount of rightness to them, it indicates that you're approaching the problem the wrong way. That the kind of language in which angles exist, which is the language of straight lines and points and angles, just doesn't include the circle as a concept, is incapable of describing a circle. Cusa says that to make scientific discoveries, we will find a coincidence of opposites. We find contradictions between what our current understanding seems to indicate, and that means that's the clue. That is the wonderful benefit that we have to be able to, unlike the animals, then go beyond our understanding and develop a higher concept. I'll just make reference to, although there's not time to really go through it, although let's see what happens with the questions, Kepler's use of metaphor. Kepler is the best example, and this is the example that LaRouche started the basement with, of this science versus mathematics. That Kepler was an astronomer, and he had a lot of work to do. He had to discover how the planets worked. He was insistent on, this was his mission. At the same time, he also had to clear up a lot of very bad thinking among other astronomers to get them to even consider his thoughts, to even think about them the right way. So when he wrote his first really huge and major work, The New Astronomy, he wrote it like a drama. It's very well composed. He has to begin it by talking from the standpoint of the people he's trying to convince, or contradict, or rattle, or scare. He starts with their language, and by observing and discussing the planets using their language of mathematics and circles, specifically I mean very geometric concepts like circles, constant motions, constant circular motions. That was how people put the planets together, the orbits together. He showed how trying to talk about the planets that way led to a contradiction. In particular, it led to two different possible distances between the Sun and the center of the orbit of Mars. He said, well, when you look at it using one approach of your whole set of thoughts, we get this distance. When we look at it in another way that you would also agree with, we got this distance. So, which distance is it? It can't be both. So Kepler used that to show them not that the distance was wrong or anything like that, but he took their entire framework of thought and then cracked it open with this demonstration in the hope that then people would take seriously his revolutionary view that it was physics that could explain the motion of the planets, which was so rejected by the mathematical astronomers of his time that it was a real fight to get them to even consider it at all. And he knew that to do that, he had to act like Plato's Socrates. Socrates talks to somebody, and he says, do you agree with A? And they say, absolutely. Do you agree with B? No. And then by starting with A, he ends up with B. And the person he's talking to says, wow, you must have tricked me. How could I possibly agree with two things that are opposite? And Socrates uses that to help people realize, there's something that you're missing. So that's rather general. I think people might have some specific ideas in mind from organizing discussions that you've had. I can give one example from something LaRouche said at a national conference or something some years back. Somebody had asked him a question about religion in the United States, and he said, well, the trouble with religion in the U.S. is there's too much of it and there's not enough. So think about what that means. What's he saying about that use of the word religion? It's no longer a word. You're now actually having to think about something. So I think I'd like to end with that. I think the the main point of this, just to recap, has been that when we've got a Glass-Steagall standard to prevent the kind of rampant and disgusting speculation, when we've got a national banking orientation where it's possible for the government to actually make decisions about projects, well, what confronts us naturally is the ability to physically value different projects to decide where should credit go. What should we be investing in? What are the kinds of long-term objectives that we should adopt and move towards? And to do that, we have to step outside for a moment the way that occurs with laws like Glass-Steagall and with national banking. We have to think, well, physically, what is our physical standard of value that'll let us then make these decisions, choose these objectives, and it provides the standpoint for understanding why a fusion crash program is the absolute front edge in terms of where we need to go to build a future. And we'll have more on that next week. So I'm going to stop there, and I would love to hear some questions, thoughts.
Okay. Thank you, Jason. So I would like to remind people that are on the telephone line listening in, you can now hit *6 to get in the queue to ask a question to Jason. People that are listening over YouTube can send your emails to LaRouche's4laws@gmail.com. That's LaRouche's, the number 4, laws@gmail.com. And so we've got a couple questions that I'll relay to you that have come in already while people are getting in the queue. And I'm assuming you can hear me okay, Jason?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So the first one that has come in deals with basically this idea of overpopulation. And the person says, we're confronted so much with this idea of overpopulation. Now you talk about potential relative population density. Is it possible that we can reach a limit where the population will grow, or will it always keep growing?
That's a good question. I think that, if you really wanted to, in terms of where the limit would be, we're certainly so far below it that it's hard to actually imagine what would truly become too many people. Although, a traffic jam in New York City can get you thinking that way. But for the most of the planet, it's quite empty. For the most part, we don't live on or under the oceans, for example. We don't live underground very much. We don't live on the ground very much in most of the planet. There's so much emptiness. So to put this into context, overpopulation isn't something that became a concern in the 1960s. Overpopulation has been raised by, take for example Malthus. This is several hundred years ago. Malthus, who was a wonderful British parson of all people, said that, you know what? He had this silly idea that he stole from some French knuckleheads, where he said that population increases geometrically, whereas food increases arithmetically, and therefore if you draw an arithmetic and a geometric curve, we're going to run out of food in the future. Well, yeah, if that was true, we would have run out of food, but we obviously didn't. I mean, obviously the economy's been going in the wrong direction for some time, but go back 50 years in the United States, did people live better and have easier access to food in the U.S. 50 years ago or in England 400 years ago? I don't think that's a hard question. Obviously in the U.S. 50 years ago. So that, you go back to Rome, go back to myths from Greece, go back to the Atrahasis epic from the Babylonian Empire or whatever. I mean, since thousands of years BC, the idea of overpopulation has been raised as a concern by empire. So, I mean, frankly, when you really don't want any people around because your goal is to maintain your control, and it's much easier to do that when there are less people and when they are less able to think and less able to act on their thoughts, you don't really want a lot of people. People who are in poverty, easier to control. Not because they're not going to get angry, that happens to people in poverty, but the kinds of concepts that are really going to defeat empire, you don't come to know them automatically by suffering. They actually require development. So anyway, just to say that overpopulation is not a new concern from the last 50 years. It's something that empire has said over millennia, and it's simply untrue. That if we take a look at the real history that we have, not somebody's concerns of the moment of saying, here's this mathematical model run by the Limits to Growth book in the the 60s and 70s. Instead of looking at that and saying, our chart shows that we're going to run out of food, and by the late 1990s, instead, if we look over the history of mankind, actually, I'm sorry, this is actually one of the very crucial parts in this. I meant to go through this. It was in my outline, but I wanted to go quicker. That LaRouche attacks this book, The Limits to Growth, because this was put out by Club of Rome in I think 72, and it's a book that says let's look at what the future of mankind will be. And they made a computer model and they put in, some idea of the world's resources and how pollution is impacted by production and how much food each person needs to eat and how reproductive rates will change based on, living standards and all of this. And then they ran their computer model and it said that we're doomed in, a few decades. What that model actually proved was that the computer model that they made, which did not include technological development, would be the end of mankind. The actual conclusion from these kinds of studies, and there is a real conclusion you can reach from them, except that they're pretty silly computer things, is that we have to continue to progress. And that is true. We never can stop. And fracking is an excellent example of this. We should have moved beyond petroleum by now. It's kind of obscene how much we still use petroleum as an energy source instead of, saving it for making plastics and materials and other things it's really useful for. But so now we're fracking to get, this kind of stuff out of the ground. It's so stupid. Does each fracking well make money? Possibly. Does it have actual environmental problems? Yes, quite possibly. In some certain cases, definitely. But the bigger thing is, why are we even doing this? Why don't we have fusion power by now? Why don't we have nuclear power in a broader way? So with those kinds of technologies, it's just these kinds of concerns, frankly, vanish. A lack of resources, of materials, raw materials, it's not a problem at all. Not a problem at all. Back when people had to, find iron from meteorites and there was very little of it, you'd say, yeah, we're going to run out of iron really soon. But with the development of metallurgy, there's plenty of iron. So let me just say that about that. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So Steve from Texas asked the question of the combination of morality and potential relative population density. And he says, is there a connection between the two? Could you say that potential population density, if it's really understood, becomes like a moral law?
Yes. Yes, I think so. In a couple of respects. One is that were we not to increase our potential relative population density, civilization will die. And you can't stay still as a human species. We need to continue moving and developing new things. So on that scale of things, yes, that it's a moral necessity for the continuation of the human species. And generally watching somebody die and doing nothing to help them is not considered very moral. The same thing is true if you're not one person but an entire society. And morality shouldn't stop with your neighborhood or something like that. It has to encompass the entire world. That all has to be in you. The other aspect of it is that every individual human being is not being treated as a truly human person when that aspect of themselves, that creative aspect of themselves, isn't nurtured. What I mean by that is that if we adopt this increase of potential relative population density and increasing the rate of that growth, that's what Mr. LaRouche calls economic value. When we adopt that as a national mission or collaborative international mission, we've just now redefined what people are. No longer are people to be seen as, well, will they work for cheap? Can we make some money off of their labor this year? Can we give them lots of parking tickets and milk some money out of them? Instead of looking at people in those terms at all, it becomes, wow, what are the problems that we need to solve? Who is the person who's going to figure that out? Was it the child who was going to have developed a totally new approach to cancer this year? Did they die 20 years ago because there wasn't any sanitation in the country they were born in? You just don't know. I mean, we also need a different approach to biology, but the point is that how do you actually see every individual human being, and do you see them as having a potentially beautiful role in taking part in that process that unfortunately far too few people have really actively participated in? There's that, and then if we don't develop, we're not going to survive. And preventing, mass suicide, I think, is a moral act.
Okay. So people that are on the telephone line listening, this might be your last chance if you want to jump in to ask Jason a question. Those of you who are listening over the internet, you can send your questions in to Jason, and he will answer them via email. And it wouldn't surprise me at some point if after the Four Laws series comes to an end, we might even have an idea of maybe having a class or so after that, just as a refresher, just to kind of put it all together as a one for people. Because obviously Mr. LaRouche doesn't want us to think of the four laws as just each four separate things, as you've mentioned, but as a totality, as a one.
Mm-hmm.
So the people on the call-in line, *6 will get you in the queue to ask your question. And then we have one other question that comes from Mary in Texas also. Texas is represented well today. Asking about how fast should you have population increase? Should it be a slow increase, a steady increase, or should it be an increase that is just as fast as you can? How do we deal with this population increase? Do we try to do it steady, or is it you just go out and try to do everything that you can?
Well, I don't know if we need to, actively encourage, couples to have as many babies as possible. So I think that it sort of handles itself naturally. I don't think that we're in a pitch situation where we should be concerned about making too many new people. That concern comes from, look, it's a difficult thing, because you say, well, look at the context we're in right now. You might say, well, can you afford to take care of a child? That's not an illegitimate concern. That's a real thing I wonder about. You might say, is this a world I want to bring children into? That's not a crazy thought. It's a messy world. But we don't need to, try to. I don't think we need to try to hold back on that. I don't think it needs particular control in that sense. I mean, below you do need a certain rate of growth. I'll tell you why. I mean, one aspect of it is that people retire. And that, take, for example, what we're seeing right now with Social Security and Medicare and baby boomers and all of this. The baby boomers are retiring. Now, the fact that the baby boom wasn't followed up by, a baby boom or, a second boom or anything like that, that we had a very large increase in population that then slowed. Part of what's going on with Social Security and Medicare is just the attempt to kill people and, privatize Social Security and reduce, healthcare costs and that kind of thing. So that's one aspect of it. On the other hand, from physical terms, you do need to have the ability for the productive part of your workforce. So, say age 20 to 65 or so, they got to support, or 18 to, whatever. Those working people have to support the young and the retired and the sick and other people. So you have to develop more people to be able to do that. And this is something that Modi had made a point of, Modi of India at the BRICS conference, where he said our countries are young. He brought up India in particular. It's got a very young demographic. And he said the future belongs to the young. The potential to move things, to develop things starts there. So I think that's all I can say about that. Let's see if someone's got. I've got a question that I wouldn't mind posing and answering, but I presume somebody on that conference call who is not being excessively bashful should ask something too.
So go ahead with your question, Jason. It looks like we'll let the conference line gain their courage.
All right, shame on you guys, just listening in and not saying anything, huh? Well, this is just one of the aspects here. Was about monetary theory, and in this, Paul addressed this in a, I thought, really great way in the last class. But back to the PR and propaganda and all of that aspect of things. LaRouche says that most of what counts as economics is just monetarism, and most of what counts as monetary theory is just people trying to defend illegal practices. So a lot of what people end up making up, I mean, for those for those people on the phone who you've gone to your state capital or you've come to Congress with us or you've just in general organizing. Well, usually not general organizing. You gotta usually got to get people who are targeted by bankers, where people end up saying things like, "Well, we need derivatives. We have to manage risk. How are we supposed to manage risk without derivatives?" Or people end up thinking they end up making these arguments about why these bizarre financial products are required. And you realize that, you know, the origin of these thoughts isn't people who are really trying to do good with the economy. That the origin of these things is speculative banking, financial empire, coming up with justifications for financial techniques that allow them to manipulate things. So I suppose that's not actually it's not exactly a question, but it was one other thing that I wanted to bring up, that in Mr. LaRouche's economics book, he's got one chapter on monetarism, and he says, frankly, that's all you really need. People might not like that, but that's all you really need. Once you clear out the defense of usury and the defense of these kinds of policies, monetarism is actually pretty simple, which I think we got a sense of from Paul the past couple of weeks. National banking might not be the easiest thing to wrap your mind around, but it actually makes sense, and it's not based on allowing every imaginable transaction to occur, which is what we've got right now. And then a one-line quote from Lynn about this this thing about how every person's value depends on their context, where an example he gives, probably everybody's heard this one already, but he talks about the auto mechanic doing the same job on two cars. One's owned by a productive worker, one's owned by a pimp, and the value of that work done depends on the value of it. What is that car going to be used for? And that the impact of our lives has a positive impact, a negative impact, possibly almost zero impact on this development of population potential. But he says all and each among us is a person of universal importance. And we owe it to people that we meet to help them realize that, even if at first they don't want to.
Okay. So with that, we're going to close out the session. I'd just like to say thanks to Jason, because this discussion on potential population density and was a major factor, I know, in many people in our organization today, that once they understood this idea that you're talking about a potential relative population density, it changed their lives. And it becomes personal for people, that it is, as this one questioner talked about, morality. It becomes a very personal thing, that you have a responsibility to be a part of that increase of potential relative population density. So when you or Paul or Mr. LaRouche talk about it, it harkens back to the times when we made, some of us older people actually made that discovery ourselves, in fighting through the free market versus the American system. And so I'd like to thank you, and hopefully what we can do is, as people send in questions, we'll get them to you, and then we can post them up on the YouTube site, your response to the questions as well. We'll do that with the questions that Paul also got. And if you want to make some final comments, the floor is open.
Just one quick one, which is that that it's just such from a much higher level, so that when when you with these concepts, you don't really wind up in debates or nitty kind of debates with people about things. Like at the table, people have got some economic view or another, but it's just very hard to evade a physical value of economics. And so some of these global concepts, energy flux density, potential relative population density, it's just sort of unavoidable as a very basic scientific viewpoint of this. I'd also point to make a little plug here. The 21st Century just put out this 2-volume anthology of the work of Vladimir Vernadsky. So this includes translations that 21st Century's done over the years, articles on, actually very specifically on energy flux density. The one in the noosphere book in particular includes some work on Vernadsky's views of measures of evolution. Basically there's a lot of parallels between how life has evolved and the measures of the evolution of life, including increased flow of biogenic, the increased flow of material through life, the increased flow of energy through life, changes in metabolic rates, etc. That provides really incredible analogies to human economics. So very, very clear analogies. So I can just say that these are this 2-volume set came out. You can find it on Amazon. Just search for 150 Years of Vernadsky, and you'll find it. Or we'll put this in the video description. If you go to bit.ly/Vernadsky-150, it'll be put it in the video description. You can get yourself a copy of those, and that provides another very Mr. LaRouche has really been emphasizing the work of Vernadsky over the past couple of months, saying that it's an essential. His view of science is really an essential thing that we need to bring both to our work on economics and then also to the broader questions of space. That it provides a unique approach, a needed additional approach to resolving some of the problems that were left by Planck and Einstein about quantum and then also the very large and on the galactic scale. So I'll say that that's a preview. Get the anthology, read it through for yourself, and we're going to have more material on that over time on the LaRouchePAC site. So
okay.
Yeah.
And next week we'll be back with the 4th in the series on the Fusion platform. So thank you for listening, and come back next week. Good night.